Imagine a time when half of England was ruled not by kings, but by fierce Norse warriors who left their homeland to carve out a new one. How did the Vikings, once feared raiders, transform into settlers who changed the very fabric of England? Imagine a time when England wasn't just one united kingdom, but a land divided by different cultures, laws, and rulers. In the late 8th century, a fierce and terrifying force began to sweep through the northern parts of England, the Vikings. Their fast and relentless longboats traveled across the seas from Scandinavia, bringing with them not just war, but a cultural and societal revolution that would leave its mark on England for centuries. This was the beginning of the Viking Age, an era that saw the Vikings set their roots deep into the English soil with the establishment of a region known as the Danelaw. But what exactly was the Danelaw, and how did it change the course of history in England? The Vikings didn't just raid, they settled. And their settlements weren't temporary. They built lasting structures, villages, and towns that became crucial parts of England's future. Initially, the Vikings arrived as raiders, plundering monasteries and towns along England's coastline. It started with the infamous raid on Lindisfarne in 793 AD, a brutal attack that shocked the Anglo-Saxons. Over the next few decades, these raids continued, intensifying with each passing year. But the Vikings had bigger plans than just raids. They didn't only want treasure, they wanted land, resources, and power. By the mid-9th century, the Viking presence had shifted from short-term raiding to long-term settlement. Instead of just taking riches, they began carving out territories and establishing new communities and kingdoms. One of the most significant outcomes of their migration to England was the creation of the Danelaw, a region governed by Viking law, customs, and culture. The Danelaw was not a single unified state, but rather a loose confederation of Viking-controlled territories in northeastern and central England. It was the result of a series of invasions and wars between the Anglo-Saxons and Vikings, which led to the Vikings gaining control over a large swath of England. The term Danelaw refers to the law and customs brought to the land by the Vikings, who were primarily from Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. The geographical boundaries of the Danelaw are often debated, but it is generally agreed that it included much of modern-day Yorkshire, Northumbria, East Anglia, and the Midlands, along with key cities such as York, Lincoln, and Nottingham. These were areas where Viking settlers, also known as Danes, had established control. It wasn't just about territory. It was about the Vikings imposing their laws, culture, and language onto the Anglo-Saxons in these regions. At its peak, the Danelaw stretched from the Humber River in the south to the Scottish border in the north, and from the eastern coast of England to the Welsh border. The Vikings effectively controlled this territory, creating a powerful Viking influence over the region. So, why did the Vikings leave their homelands and set sail for England? It wasn't just for plunder. There were deeper reasons for their migrations, reasons that laid the groundwork for the establishment of the Danelaw. One of the primary reasons was overpopulation in Scandinavia. As their populations grew, resources such as land, food, and materials became scarce. In a society where land was the key to wealth and survival, many Vikings found themselves looking outward for new opportunities. There was also a growing sense of adventure and ambition. Norse culture valued exploration, raiding, and the pursuit of glory. Young Viking warriors sought fame, fortune, and a place in their sagas. This led many to take to the seas, not only to raid, but to conquer new lands, establish settlements, and build their legacy. Additionally, internal conflict in Scandinavia and the lure of riches from more prosperous lands drove many Vikings to venture south. By the time they reached England, they were not only looking for treasure, but were ready to make a home, establishing their kingdoms and laws on foreign soil. The Viking invasions that led to the establishment of the Danelaw were not random. They were coordinated efforts by powerful Viking leaders who sought to gain control over England. Among the most notable Viking leaders were Ivar the Boneless, Guthrum, and Hastings. Ivar the Boneless was one of the leaders of the infamous Great Heathen Army, which invaded England in 865 A.D. This large and organized Viking army, made up of warriors from across Scandinavia, aimed to conquer and settle in England. Ivar's leadership was pivotal in the success of the Viking invasions. His strategic brilliance and cruelty in battle helped the Vikings gain significant ground in the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Guthrum was another key Viking leader who famously led the Vikings in their war against King Alfred the Great of Wessex. After his defeat by Alfred in the Battle of Edington, Guthrum eventually agreed to a peace settlement, which resulted in the formal establishment of the Danelaw in many parts of England. Guthrum's treaty with Alfred was a major milestone, ensuring the Vikings' long-term presence in England. Hastings, one of the Viking warlords, was known for his persistent raids on southern England, continuing the Viking presence in the region long after the formal establishment of the Danelaw. These leaders, along with their armies, made the Danelaw a force to be reckoned with in medieval England. Once the Vikings had established their settlements, they had to govern them. The system of governance in the Danelaw was rooted in Viking law, which was different from the Anglo-Saxon systems of rule. The Vikings operated under a system known as Thing law, a form of assembly where free men came together to discuss matters of law and justice. This system was quite democratic in nature, allowing for local decision-making and community involvement. Viking society was also highly structured, with distinct social classes. At the top were the kings and jarls, noblemen, who controlled the land and people. Below them were the carls, freemen, who were farmers, traders, and warriors. At the bottom were the thralls, slaves, who had no rights and were forced to work for their masters. In terms of daily life, the Vikings valued honor and courage, and these values permeated their legal and social systems. This meant that conflicts were often settled through blood feuds or negotiations, depending on the severity of the dispute. Viking law was harsh, but it was effective in maintaining order within their settlements. The Vikings were not just warriors. They were also skilled traders, farmers, and craftsmen. Once they settled in England, they began to develop a thriving economy based on agriculture, trade, and craftsmanship. Farming was the backbone of Viking life in the Danelaw. The Vikings brought with them advanced agricultural techniques, including plowing methods that improved crop yields. They raised cattle, sheep, and pigs, and grew crops like barley, oats, and rye. Viking settlements became prosperous due to their effective farming practices, which ensured food security for the growing population. Trade was another crucial aspect of the Viking economy. The Vikings established extensive trade networks, linking England with Scandinavia, the Baltic, and even parts of Russia. Towns like York became key trading hubs where goods such as furs, timber, and iron were exchanged. The Vikings also traded in silver, which became one of the most important forms of currency in the Danelaw. Craftsmanship was highly valued in Viking society. The Vikings were expert metalworkers, producing weapons, tools, and jewelry with intricate designs. They were also skilled shipbuilders, creating long ships that were fast and maneuverable. making them ideal for both raiding and trading. These craftsmanship skills were passed down to their Anglo-Saxon neighbors, blending Viking techniques with local traditions to create a unique artistic style. Despite their success, the Vikings were not able to hold on to their English territories forever. Over time, the Anglo-Saxons, led by kings like Alfred the Great, Edward the Elder, and Aethelstan, began to push back against Viking rule. Alfred's strategic defense of Wessex and his victory at the Battle of Edington in 878 AD marked a turning point in the war between the Anglo-Saxons and Vikings. Following Alfred's victories, the Vikings were forced to sign peace treaties, which created a fragile coexistence between the two cultures. The Vikings continued to hold territories in the north and east of England, but the Anglo-Saxons were gradually reclaiming land. By the 10th century, most of the Danelaw had fallen back under Anglo-Saxon control. Even though the Vikings were eventually pushed out of most of England, their legacy remains deeply embedded in the fabric of English culture. The Viking influence on the English language, place names, and legal systems is still evident today. Words like sky, egg, and law come from Old Norse, while towns like Grimsby, Derby, and Whitby still bear Viking names. The Vikings also left their mark on English architecture, art, and literature. The stories of Odin, Thor, and Loki continue to inspire modern-day writers and filmmakers, and their influence can be seen in films, books, and TV shows, including the popular series Vikings. In the regions that were once part of the Danelaw, Viking heritage remains a point of pride. Festivals like the Jorvik Viking Festival in York celebrate the Vikings' lasting impact on England's history and culture. The Vikings may have arrived as raiders, but they left behind a rich legacy that helped shape the England we know today. The creation of the Danelaw was just one part of their influence on English society. Through their settlements, governance systems, and cultural contributions, the Vikings transformed England, leaving a lasting imprint that continues to shape the country's language, law, and identity. The Danelaw wasn't just a temporary Viking kingdom. It was the foundation for a new and unified England, forged in the fires of Viking ambition and endurance. As we wrap up the story of the Vikings and their lasting impact on England, one question remains. How did a fragmented land, torn by conflict and invasion, eventually unite under a single ruler? That answer lies with one of England's most legendary kings, Alfred the Great. If you're curious to discover how he turned the tide against the Vikings and laid the groundwork for a unified England, make sure to check out my next video on Alfred the Great and the unification of England. And if you're enjoying these deep dives into England's fascinating history, don't forget to explore my previous videos, where I cover topics like the rise of Mercia under King Offa and the Danelaw and Viking settlements. You'll uncover more stories that shaped the England we know today. Keep watching, keep learning, and stay curious, because history is far from over. See you in the next video.